finding ways to move beyond the retributive framework is a very valuable project indeed, bringing together people from neuropsychology, criminology, law, psychology, and philosophy to compare ideas is a great way to advance that project. So how do we move beyond moral responsibility and just desserts and retribution to a system that works? Thank you. A system that works not only in reducing crime and reducing recidivism, but also improving society and enriching lives. Basically, we know what needs to be done. Read Adrian's wonderful book, The Anatomy of Violence, and it will tell you many of the basic biosocial issues for crime. Then study the work of Gregg and Dirk on the public health model, and we'll learn how we ought to fix those problems and the causes. Study the positive programs of the Scandinavian justice system, and learn what not to do from examining the egregious U.S. injustice system. Read John Calendar's work on an artistic model of responsibility to gain a better perspective on a richer alternative to retributive moral responsibility. That will take us giant steps towards solving the problems. Obviously, there's much more research to be done on the causes of crime and the roots of social problems and how to fix them. But we already know a tremendous amount about what needs to be done. So why aren't we doing it? John Locke said that philosophers should be under-laborers in the work of science. We should be clearing away the verbal confusions and obsolete beliefs that are impediments to the work of scientists. I would be happy to think that I could be of service to researchers like Adrian and Olivia and Farah by clearing away some of the debris that impedes the appreciation and implementation of their outstanding research. And I've been trying. It's hard. There's a major problem that prevents us from adopting and implementing the insights that these researchers have provided. And that problem is the debris of moral responsibility and just desserts and the retributive system. Clearing away that debris looks easy. We don't have the special godlike powers of self-creation that are required for genuine moral responsibility. So we should send moral responsibility to the junkyard, clear the ground for scientific research that will actually discover ways of solving our problems. But for 35 years, I've huffed and puffed to push the debris of moral responsibility out of the way, and it has hardly budged. Philosophers more creative than I, such as Dirk and Gregg, have worked at the same task, but belief in moral responsibility has not disappeared. So just to be clear, all blame for the failure to rid the world of moral responsibility should be assigned to Dirk and Gregg, not to me. Why is it so hard to get rid of the moral responsibility system? It shouldn't be. After all, the basic reason for contriving the moral responsibility system no longer exists. Why did we concoct something as implausible as moral responsibility in the first place? The real problem started when God became just. As Bernard Williams makes clear, so long as the gods were tricksters and con men, then no one expected the gods and the world governed by the gods to promote justice. The ancient Greeks were entrapped by fated disasters, placed in horrible situations in which no matter what they did, they would commit a terrible crime, and they suffered punishment for their fated wrongs. But really, what would you expect from the fates and the punishments of this sort? Why would you expect them to be just? The ancient Hebraic God was just as bad. Job was a righteous and upright man who escheweth evil. And on a silly dare between God and Satan, Job's family was killed. All his possessions were lost. He was covered with painful, bleeding boils from the sole of his crown of his head to the sole of his feet. And when Job had the temerity to question God about this miserable treatment, God quickly put Job in his place. Where were you when I hung the stars in space? Canst thou draw up Leviathan with a hook? Or in other words, I'll treat you however I wish, you miserable worm, and justice has nothing to do with it. But eventually, the world became more orderly, and the governing God became a God of order and justice. And then there was a big problem. How can it be just for God to punish us for our sins, and punish quite severely, when omnipotent God made us this way? Lorenzo Valla asked that question in his famous dialogue on free will, and he had no answer. He recommended that we stop asking the question. Martin Luther, a bit later, asked the same question, decided there was no reasonable answer, and concluded that we should reject reason and accept the justice of God by faith. Pico della Mirandola offered an elaborate libertarian answer. God grants to humans his last and favorite creation, a godlike power to make themselves by their own choices. It was rank heresy. If God gives special first cause powers to humans, then God is no longer omnipotent. In any case, it made no sense. Who would be doing the choosing? Heretical nonsense it might be, but it became very popular and remains so to this day. We are morally responsible because we have the special power to make ourselves. From Free Will Southern Baptist to atheistic existentialist, the idea that we are morally responsible because we are self-made is very appealing. Even a sober empiricist like Dan Dennett is not immune to its charms. Dan says, I take responsibility for anything I make and then inflict upon the general public. If my soup causes food poisoning or my robot runs amok and kills someone, I, the manufacturer, am to blame. I am held responsible for releasing the product to the public with whatever flaws it has. Common wisdom has it that much the same rationale grounds personal responsibility. I have created and unleashed an agent who is myself. If its acts produce harm, the manufacturer is held responsible. And then it says, I think this common wisdom is indeed wisdom. So we justly deserve our rewards and punishments because of our own creative powers of self-making. Or if not complete self-making, at least Frankfurt's higher order reflective approval of our own characters and desires, or in John Martin Fisher's formulation, a deep approval of living my own way. The brilliant libertarian and compatibilist efforts have provided a variety of philosophical insights and some very creative models. But short of appeal to miracles, and with miracles you can prove anything, they have failed to provide an account of how punishment could be justly deserved, given the enormous role that luck plays in shaping our characters, circumstances, and outcomes. And yet philosophers, and not just philosophers, but some psychologists, and lots of legal theorists, not to mention the general public, hang on to moral responsibility like a fox terrier with a cherished bedroom slipper. The strange thing about this fervent but hopeless quest to find grounds for moral responsibility is that it's a search for a solution to a problem that no longer exists. The motive for establishing an account of moral responsibility is long since gone. There is no just God in heaven making everything right with the world. We don't have to prove that the world is just when clearly it is not. We don't have to solve the problem of evil. We don't need Voltaire to tell us that this is not the best of all possible worlds. And we don't need to show that punishment is just when obviously it is not. Moral responsibility was contrived to make the punishment that God inflicts, and that in some cases we must inflict, just. So long as we live in a just world governed by a just God, then God's punishments must be just, and the punishments that we must inflict must be just. But if there's no just God, and we do not live in a just world, and it is not true that ought implies can, and that ought not implies that we cannot, then we're no longer compelled to contrive an implausible story about moral responsibility. Moral responsibility is a desperate solution to an obsolete problem. So why is it so hard to haul away the moral responsibility debris? It's difficult to eliminate because it's held securely in place by a larger system of belief. Retributivism is part of a system supported by belief in a just world. And that belief has not disappeared even when we realize that it is obviously false. Instead, it's gone underground, a deep, non-conscious belief that causes us to conclude that rape victims must be bad, that ought implies can, and that the rich and the poor are reaping what they sowed and receiving their just deserts. Melvin Lerner, who pioneered research on just world beliefs, called belief in a just world a fundamental delusion. Adrian Furnham states that according to the belief in a just world, quite justly, good things tend to happen to good people, bad things to bad people, despite the fact that this is patently not the case. Paul of Tarsus, in common with most contemporary Christians, believed in a just world. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that also shall he reap. The Hindu tradition embraces the same belief in almost the same words. As a man himself sows, so he himself reaps. No man inherits the good or evil act of another man. The fruit is of the same quality as the action. In contrast, Jesus of Nazareth knew that many reap where they did not sow, and rape, I suppose, as well, knew that many reap where they did not sow, and deprived those who sowed of any benefits. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. The rich get poorer, and the poor get exploited in our unjust world. Belief in a just world provides comfort and confidence. Behave well in this just world, and you'll be safe and secure. But when we observe innocent children afflicted with terrible diseases, innocent people dying in earthquakes, famines, ethnic purges, innocent people who are victims of brutal, violent rape, how can we preserve the comforting belief in a just world? It's easy. The innocent victims were not so innocent. The impoverished person is lazy. The tsunami victims offended God by their evil ways. An undersecretary of education in the Reagan administration insisted that sick children bring their suffering on themselves through vile behavior in a previous life. The rape victim invited the attack by her provocative dress and promiscuous lifestyle. She must have brought this on herself. Otherwise, I and my loved ones could be subject to unjust suffering, and the comfort of belief in a just world is destroyed. Those with the strongest belief in a just world are also most likely to blame victims for their misfortune, and innocent victims are not only blamed by others, but also blame themselves. While the folk may believe in a just world, we might expect philosophers to resist it, since philosophers, as everyone knows, are exceptionally wise. But as Bernard Williams makes clear, the history of Western philosophy is permeated by belief in a just world. Plato's Republic was written to prove that the world is just and that virtue always triumphs over vice. Aristotle's Ethics, flourishing happiness is the mark of a genuinely virtuous man. Belief in a just world reaches its philosophical apex in Kant, The world must be such that every person has the power to freely follow the path of virtue, and whatever we ought to do, invariably we can do. We all know that the world is not fair and just, that we do not always reap what we sow, and that in any case we are sowing different varieties of seed over different qualities of soil using widely divergent horticultural skills. Or rather, we know it when we consciously scrutinize the belief. But belief in a just world usually operates non-consciously and exerts its subtle influence on some of the most impressive members of the philosophical tribe. George Scher is a rigorous observer. He knows that the world is not inherently fair and just, and that we do not all enjoy essentially equal opportunity. But his non-conscious belief in a just world still exerts a powerful influence on his ideas and arguments. Scher tells us a charming story of overcoming initial disadvantages by working harder. Differences in strength, intelligence, and other native gifts, Scher says, are rarely so pronounced as to negate just deserts. The far more common effect of such differences is merely to make it more difficult for the talented person to reach a given level of attainment. He must work harder, husband his resources more carefully, plan more shrewdly, and so on. Fortitude, self-confidence, the ability to plan shrewdly, actually these cluster with other advantages rather than offsetting those advantages in a just world distribution. Scher's story of one who works harder and overcomes initial disadvantages follows a popular plot. The resolute tortoise outraces the lethargic hare. The little engine scales the great mountain. Ragged Dick, one of Horatio Alger's heroes, starts as a homeless bootblack on the New York City streets, but thanks to his energy, industriousness, honesty, and optimistic attitude, achieves success and makes up for superior skill. These stories are fiction. Fortitude and skill are more often joined, as inferior skill and poor education and lack of opportunity result in lethargy, while greater initial advantages also have cumulative effects. But deep belief in a just world motivates belief in equal opportunity and moral responsibility. The moral responsibility system makes us feel good. We justly deserve our privileged places, and we shouldn't worry about those who are suffering. They justly deserve it. The punitive measures that we inflict are justly deserved, and rather than feeling bad when we punish, we feel righteous. We have a deep animal strike-back desire, and moral responsibility clothes that primitive desire in robes of justice. Furthermore, if and only if I do right, then I'll prosper in this just and orderly world, and I must be doing right because I am prospering. No wonder that's hard to reject, obviously false though it is. And belief in a just world, which is the foundation of our system, has gone deep into our non-conscious belief system, and that makes it even more difficult to dislodge. Moving beyond retributivism requires major changes, including substantive cultural changes. But those changes are not impossible. In some cultures, the changes are well underway, cultures that sociologists call social democratic corporatist cultures, such as those found in Norway and Sweden. Unfortunately, the neoliberal cultures, such as the US and the UK, seem to be moving in the opposite direction as demagogues exploit punitive populism and xenophobia to ratchet up fear and blame and punishment. But to focus on the positive, there are cultures that are making serious progress toward minimizing or even eliminating retributive just deserts and the radical individualism that is its close consort. Michael Cavadino and James Dignan note that in social democratic corporatist cultures, people are not so ruthlessly held responsible for the offenses they have committed, which are less likely to be attributed to the free will of the individual offender And as they point out, there is a greater willingness to assume a degree of collective responsibility for the fact that an offense has been committed. This reduced insistence on individual moral responsibility is part of a larger system based in, as they call it, a communitarian ethos that fosters more inclusionary economic and social policies. In social democratic corporate cultures, as they say, the corporate citizen, unlike the neoliberal, is much more his brother's keeper, even if he has done wrong, with a stronger sense of there but for the grace of God go I, in terms of both economic failure and criminal activity. As the US and the UK sink deeper into neoliberal retributivism and radical individualism, it's important to recognize that there are cultural alternatives. Important because it indicates that such change is at least possible, that there is a better path to follow, and also because it explains that retributivism is difficult to dislodge because it is held in place by a larger cultural system. Cultural change is not an easy process. In the neoliberal US, it seems that when we take a couple of small steps forward, those are followed by several giant steps backward. But the outlook is not totally bleak. Even in the bastions of neoliberalism, there are significant forces pushing in the opposite direction. Those positive forces are not the work of philosophers who seem dedicated to keeping the moribund system of moral responsibility on life support. Instead, they emerge from contemporary developments in business management and workplace engineering. In studying the most efficient and effective workplace settings, workplace engineers found that the best models are not those that celebrate the neoliberal values of authoritarian top-down management and control by blaming and shaming of errant individuals. To the contrary, the most effective workplace models are those that reject individual blame and shame and instead seek the deeper systemic causes of errors and mistakes, models in which everyone works together as a team to fix the problems. In that setting, where workers do not fear blame and shame for mistakes, the deeper causes of errors and problems are sought out and fixed. And harmless errors and near misses and potential problems aren't hidden, but instead are uncovered and fixed before they become disasters. The system model treats all workers as valuable team members who make important contributions with both their physical labor and their intelligent attention. Every worker in the process is empowered to bring the entire line to a halt. If a problem or potential problem is discovered, then every worker contributes to finding a solution to the problem, and there's no rigid distinction between management who provide the intelligence and planning and workers who mindlessly provide the labor. This is the no-blame system approach to the workplace that transformed Japanese manufacturing. The advantages of the system approach were too obvious to ignore, and its adoption in air traffic control was a remarkable success. Air traffic controllers had a long and frightening record of errors that resulted in terrifying near misses and sometimes in catastrophe. Controllers worked under conditions of enormous stress in a complex and intense system, with constant handoffs of flights to a controller in another region, flight names and instructions that were easily confused and misunderstood, very limited resources for detecting mistakes. Errors could be disastrous. They were deemed absolutely unacceptable. Any controller error was assumed to be the result of negligence. In such conditions, controllers struggled to hide errors or deflect the blame onto others. Small errors were covered up or not reported, and the underlying problems were not addressed, resulting in more errors until finally an error resulted in a near miss or an accident that could not be hidden. When that happened, the negligent controller was blamed and fired, and the problem was supposedly solved. When the morally responsible negligent worker is blamed for the problem, no deeper inquiry is needed or allowed, and the deeper destructive causes remain in place. The no-blame system model brought a radical and valuable change to the working conditions of air traffic controllers. Rather than blaming individual controllers for errors, controllers were encouraged and commended for reporting small errors and the circumstances in which they occurred. The inevitable errors were no longer hidden. Information containing error patterns could be collected and analyzed, and problems could be found and fixed before they caused harm. Controllers were treated as respected team members committed to discovering and fixing problems, working together with a shared commitment to making air traffic control as error-free as possible, not only by finding and reporting system flaws that were causing errors, but also by devising a system of multiple checks that would catch errors before they became disasters, rather than isolated individuals who faced the constant stress of meeting an impossible standard of perfection. Controllers became valuable members of a team that sought out sources of error, devised effective means of fixing them. Rather than working under the fear of blame and punishment, controllers shared a commitment to a valuable enterprise. Rather than seeking non-existent infallible workers, the no-blame system approach created an almost infallible system. In the U.S., conservative estimates place the number of hospital deaths caused by errors at between 40,000 and 100,000 annually, the equivalent of more than 3 jetliners crashes every week. In an effort to address this frightening problem, some hospitals in the US and the UK have adopted a beyond blame and shame policy, and that's essentially the no-blame system model applied to hospitals. While the policy has enjoyed considerable success in reducing errors, it's also generated a lot of opposition. That there should be resistance to the no-blame system approach is hardly a surprise. After all, the basic principles of the no-blame system model are those of the social democratic corporatist cultures: communitarian commitments, rejection of blame and shame, focus on understanding and solving the deep systemic sources of problems, in fundamental opposition to the authoritarianism and retributivism and radical individualism of the larger neoliberal culture. In hospitals, much of the opposition came from physicians who held places of individual privilege and elite status. The system approach emphasizes the valuable contribution and knowledge of all workers with a shared commitment to improving the system. Some physicians feared that would diminish their special standing. They were deeply offended by the idea that nurses and technicians could have any role in preventing the errors of infallible physicians. No way nurses or technicians could be equally valued partners in a shared enterprise with physicians. While fear of compromising one's elite individual status is one source of the opposition to the system approach, another is a basic revulsion against emphasis on systems rather than individuals, and on seeking deeper systemic causes rather than focusing blame and moral responsibility on the erring individual. Edmund Pellegrino, a bioethicist who favors a virtue theory approach to medical ethics, insists that it will be necessary to reaffirm the moral nature of medical error and retain the notions of blame, accountability, and responsibility. Pellegrino fears that a system approach will promote complacency and that shame and blame are essential sources of motivation. Pellegrino says, there are associate dangers of complacency and dulling of the moral sensibilities of the humans in a system when either a blame-free approach or a blame-the-system approach is adopted. The power of individual guilt can be constructive. Personal accountability is owed to the persons injured. The deterrent effect of shame and blame is not safely ignored. Blame and shame do indeed have an important deterrent effect. They deter discovery of the sources of errors and the solutions to underlying problems. Pellegrino fears complacency, but complacency comes with the cover-ups that the blame system promotes. The physician did not make a mistake because it was successfully covered up or because the problem was really caused by someone else, usually a nurse, sometimes a patient, to whom the blame was shifted. When medical teams make sincere efforts to find and fix the deep and difficult sources of problems, that's the opposite of complacency. So threatening is the system approach in its emphasis on studying deeper systemic causes of problems rather than blaming individuals. Pellegrino characterizes it as utopian social engineering, comparable to the malignant social engineering of totalitarian states. Shifting the heavy weight of neoliberal retributivism will require heavy lifting, and successful steps in the direction of social democratic corporatist culture are regarded as a threat. Development of the system and commitment workplace model and replacing the control model and the blame and the shame orientation is an important but essential step in the process of cultural change and the rejection of retributivism.